Professor Köchler, you've presented us with a considerable challenge when you've asked us to address the issue of hybrid threats, because, as you've said and as others have said, the term was, of course, coined by members of the United States military. The definition, though, that the American soldiers and strategic theoreticians have given to this term is extremely broad, as you can see on this quote here from the United States Joint Forces Command. Hybrid war is said to involve a mix of conventional, irregular, terrorism, and criminal means or activities, and it can be deployed by a combination of state and non-state actors. It is said to include, by others, covert action. This is the Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Covert action, economic blackmail, diplomatic duplicity, and media manipulation. Indeed, one American military expert has used the word full spectrum wars to describe hybrid wars. And he says, you can see in the second part of this quotation, the bit I've underlined, that hybrid wars include state building. I draw your attention to the use of the word full spectrum in this quotation because, of course, full spectrum is presumably an allusion to the concept of full spectrum dominance, which was coined by the United States Department of Defense in a paper published in June 2000. This means that statements made by people such as the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, the one I quoted just now, that the United States' enemies, like Russia, is conducting hybrid warfare, is a paradigmatic case of what in English we call the pot calling the kettle black. These accusations recall the media campaign which was launched this summer, in which Russia was accused of paying people to go online, paying internet trolls to fill and colonize social media and internet discussion forums with pro-Moscow views. The campaign was the pot calling the metal black because we've known that, even before Edward Snowden, that the United States, of course, does exactly the same thing. The Guardian revealed in 2011 that the Pentagon had set up had concluded a contract with a Californian corporation to set up an online persona management service, I quote, which would enable, I quote, one US serviceman or woman to control up to 10 separate identities based all over the world in various chat forums. Or again, the Washington Post, also in 2011, showed how the United States was funding technology companies to enable professional regime change operatives. We discussed regime change here last year. For instance, in Egypt, during the demonstrations in Tahrir Square, to use social networks to create Twitter revolutions. A secret policy paper, and here is an extract from it, quoted and leaked by Edward Snowden's colleague Glenn Greenwald in June 2015, revealed that GCHQ, the British intelligence service, uses the following tactics: uploading YouTube videos containing persuasive messages, establishing online aliases with Facebook, and so on. And indeed, Edward Snowden himself, in February 2014, leaked another GCHQ document. You can ignore the photograph, look at the title of the thing, The Art of Deception, Training for a New Generation of Covert Operations. The subtitle is very important. I hope you can see it on the screen. Interestingly and amusingly, the person who came up, or as far as I can tell, with this idea of colonizing social networks and colonizing cyberspace was none other than a certain Cass Sunstein, who is the husband of Samantha Power, the current American ambassador to the United Nations. He wrote in a paper in 2008 that government agents, I quote, government agents and their allies might enter chat rooms and online social networks. So covert operations, deception, and state building, I'm going to emphasize the state building aspect, are an established part of the United States' military armory. And this is what makes the hostility expressed by US military personnel against hybrid warfare when deployed by America's adversaries. This is what makes it very interesting. This frustration that we can detect when NATO theoreticians denounce hybrid warfare when practiced by America's adversaries is, of course, the age-old frustration which has been expressed throughout history by all hegemonic powers or would-be hegemonic powers against innovative ways of resisting their hegemony, from Napoleon, who lost the Peninsular War largely, or partly at least, thanks to the guerrilla, the little war that was waged by Spanish partisans, to Hitler, whose armies were, of course, famously held down by irregular forces in the Soviet Union, France, and Yugoslavia. The basic accusation which is being made with this use of hybrid threats, just as the accusation has been made in the past against irregular forces, is that the hybrid adversary refuses to play by the rules. The partisan, the irregular combatant, is condemned as an outlaw. And this is precisely, of course, what Clausewitz was drawing attention to. Professor Köchler, you mentioned Clausewitz twice in your brief that you've given us for this panel. He understood this refusal to play by the rules as the very essence of warfare itself. The very essence of warfare itself. He wrote, "As long as I have not defeated the enemy, I have to fear that he will defeat me. I am therefore no longer my own master, but he gives me the law just as I do to him. Gibt mir das Gesetz." Clausewitz uses the word Gesetz here, not just will. Warfare is not just a matter of imposing one's will on an adversary, but imposing one's law on an adversary. War, therefore, is not just a temporary act of violence, a temporary act of transient violence. It cannot be compared, as it often is by theoreticians of the laws of war, to a bank robbery where the use of violence is over as soon as it has achieved its aims. Instead, war has an absolutely definitive political element to it, because, of course, war aims at the establishment of a new regime, a new kratia. We talked about regime change on this panel last year. The point about regime change is that it aims at regime creation. In his lectures on guerrilla warfare delivered at the Military Academy in Berlin in 1810 and in 1811, Clausewitz specifically discussed guerrilla warfare and called it, I quote, "a political matter in the highest sense of the word, with a specifically revolutionary character." That's Clausewitz, a specifically revolutionary character. The phrase revolutionary character obviously means regime change. So the phrase regime change is commonly used, but hybrid war, like all war, is not just about regime change, but, I repeat, about regime creation. That is to say that hybrid wars use state-building covert operations and propaganda in the service of regime creation. Now, I want to show and demonstrate this use of various tactics for the purpose of regime creation by discussing two historical examples of how covert operations and propaganda have been used to set up new institutions. And I've called my talk the Long March Through the Institutions, taking for this a phrase which was coined by the leftist revolutionary Rudi Dutschke, who understood an important point, which is, of course, that institutions have a permanence which individual leaders do not have. And that is why any genuine revolutionary, or anybody who is genuinely looking at regime creation, regime change, regime creation, needs to set up institutions. The first example that I would like to mention to you this afternoon is the creation of pan-European structures in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, of which, of course, the most important today is the European Union. Very early on in the war, indeed, even before the United States entered it, American strategists decided that the political unification of Europe was in their interests. In October 1941, indeed in August 1941, John Foster Dulles, the future Secretary of State, argued strongly that a new world order would be needed after the war and not a restoration of the old world order. He argued that, and I quote, that Europe's old system of many sovereign states has constantly and inevitably bred war, unquote. I actually discussed and refuted and criticized this very theory, although not with respect to Dulles, in my speech to this forum in 2013. And Dulles went on, he said he wanted to put an end to sovereignty in Europe by organizing Europe as, I quote, a federated commonwealth. This is before the states entered the war in December 1941. But it wasn't through overt policy that John Foster Dulles, as Secretary of State, it wasn't through overt policy that the United States became the prime mover behind European integration, but instead through the covert operations dear to his brother Alan, who, of course, as I'm sure you know, became the director of the CIA at the same time as his brother was the Secretary of State. In the summer of 1948, Alan Dulles and William Donovan had been the head of the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor to the CIA. In 1948, the two of them, Donovan and Dulles, created the American Committee on United Europe. This was a non-profit, private organization, just like we've heard now earlier about Canvas, but in fact, all its leaders were senior intelligence operatives. Donovan was the chairman, Alan Dulles was the vice chairman, and the executive director was someone called Thomas Braden, who had served in the OSS, in Donovan's OSS, and who was to join the CIA in 1950. And one of the other board members was Walter Bedell Smith, General Walter Bedell Smith, who was to become director of the CIA also in October 1950. Now, the purpose of this American Committee on United Europe was to provide covert support, and indeed, of course, control, of the then nascent European integration process. And its creation, the creation of the American Committee, had an immediate effect. Within weeks of its creation, in October 1948, the five powers who had signed the Brussels Treaty on the 17th of March 1948, the Brussels Treaty is the treaty which brought into being the Western European Union, and which thus led to the formation of NATO a year later, the five signatory powers of the Brussels Treaty decided to establish the Council of Europe. And the European movement, which is like a political party which campaigned for European integration and which was to be a major recipient of American money through the American Committee on United Europe, was founded at the same time, indeed on the 25th of October 1948. Behind the scenes, the American Committee on United Europe played a crucial role in ensuring the success of the new European project. In the period 1948 to 1960, it was to inject over $3 million into European groups in order to garner support for the various stages of European integration. From the creation of the Council of Europe in 1949 to the US-backed announcement of the Schuman Plan on the 9th of May 1950. And of course the creation of the European Economic Community in 1957. This financial support given by the Americans was absolutely decisive in ensuring the success of the integration project in its early years. It was only thanks to American money that the European movement was saved from financial collapse in 1949 and in 1950. The European movement was to that extent a classic bogus NGO of the kind that has sprung up all over Central and Eastern Europe in the last 25 years. It was a front organization for American interests. The transfer of funds was kept secret in order to maintain the illusion that there was genuine European support for these new supranational structures. It was essential at the same time to manufacture consent for the military unification of Europe, also under American leadership, which was put in place at the same time. Let's never forget that the Council of Europe Statute was signed 1 month and 1 day after the signature of the North Atlantic Treaty. The North Atlantic Treaty is the 4th of the 4th, 1949. The Council of Europe is the 5th of the 5th. The very close proximity of these dates should remind us that the political and military unification of Europe were two aspects of one single process. American control was also used for another purpose, and this was to neutralize British opposition to European federalism. Neither the governing Labour Party nor the then opposition Conservative Party was in favour of European federalism. On the contrary, they had both expressed their opposition to it, and they were instead in favour of interstate and intergovernmental cooperation through the Council of Europe. When the coal and steel community was proclaimed in May 1950 in the Schuman Declaration, it excluded the largest producer of coal and steel in Europe at the time, which was the United Kingdom. In order to obtain, the reason why it excluded Britain was in order to obtain the desired supranational structures, to get them on paper, if necessary, by keeping Britain out. 2 months after the Schuman Declaration, the first president of the European movement, the first president of the European movement was Duncan Sandys, who was Churchill's son-in-law, was evicted from his position because of his opposition to federalism. And he was replaced instead by Paul-Henri Spaak, who of course later went on to play a major role in the creation of the European Economic Community. Sandys was got rid of following a letter written to him by the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, Joseph Rettinger, who told him to go because, I quote, "Our American friends do not agree with your tactics." And in the words of Thomas Braden, the intelligence officer I mentioned earlier, who was executive director of the American Committee on United Europe, one of the tasks of Paul-Henri Spaak's new secretariat was to generate support for federalism through the initiation of major propaganda campaigns in all European countries. Now this theory, or this argument I'm giving you about the covert nature of American support for a united Europe is not a conspiracy theory. It is instead boasted of. It's boasted of in official European history when it is said, as it often is, that the European idea grew up among resistant circles. By definition, resistant circles are, of course, circles of secret agents. One of the key people in Paul-Henri Spaak's new secretariat in 1950 was the man you can see here on the right of the picture wearing a beret, Georges Louis Rebatté, who became the Secretary General of the European movement from 1948 to 1955, and who during the war was the head of the Maquis in France. Now, the American Committee on United Europe was wound up in 1960 because, of course, its mission had by then been accomplished. The European Economic Community had been created in 1957. Covert operations and propaganda had succeeded in creating a new political and legal regime in Europe which remodeled the continent along post-national, federal, and frankly, American lines. I now want to discuss a second example of rule setting or regime creation, and that is the example of international tribunals. They've been mentioned already, after the end of the Cold War. In the wake of 1991, the maintenance and even strengthening of the American bridgehead into the Eurasian continent was, of course, a priority, and new horizons had opened up for it with the geopolitical vacuum created by the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. This reinforcement of the American role in Europe and in the world was done by profiling the US and its allies as bearers of universal values, which no structures of state sovereignty had the moral right to resist. The United States played a key role in the creation of the very first ad hoc international tribunal, the Yugoslav tribunal based in The Hague. The project was announced by the United States Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger in December 1992, partly, incidentally, to scupper European peace plans, which were then on the table. And it was created, brought into being formally a few months later in May 1993 by a United Nations Security Council resolution. The ambassador, the United States ambassador to the UN at the time, was Madeleine Albright, who was later to be called, as Secretary of State, was later to be called the mother of the tribunal by one of the ICTY's presidents. But this was only the overt side of the US operation. The covert side was just as important. William Walker was head of the Kosovo verification mission, and it was his allegations about war crimes at Račak in January 1999 which sparked off the move toward war, the NATO attack on Yugoslavia later on in that year. Walker headed a body, the Kosovo verification mission, which was stuffed full of agents, of secret agents. His own chief of staff, a man called Mike Phillips, was a career officer from United States Air Force intelligence. Walker, of course, himself was an old hand at regime change operations. He had been responsible for Central America in the 1980s, and he had played a key role in the overthrow of General Noriega. Now, we learnt about the covert aspect of American support for European integration only in 1997, so it's going to take a while before we learn much about the covert role played by Americans in the international criminal tribunals. But I would like to draw your attention to one aspect that we do already know about, and that is the role of the Americans in one of the ad hoc tribunals, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which tried the former president of Liberia, Charles Taylor. This court, 80% of whose funding came from the United States, had as its chief prosecutor, the founding chief prosecutor, a man who is now a law professor at Syracuse University, and who, at the time when he became prosecutor at the Special Court of Sierra Leone, had never once in his entire career been a prosecuting counsel or indeed had any courtroom experience at all. On the contrary, David Crane, now Professor Crane, had for 30 years been a senior military intelligence officer, and for 15 years he had the top level of security clearance. If you doubt me, you can go onto this webpage, the one I'm showing you here from the University of Syracuse, and consult his own CV, such as he puts it here, where he says that he had, as I say, this highest clearance. Moreover, he was in charge of the multi-billion, you can see the screen also there, Professor, on there. He was in charge of the multi-billion review of, the management review of the multi-billion-dollar budget of the Department of Defense. Crane, incidentally, although he, of course, formally joined the United Nations in 2002, in fact, behaved as if he was still working for the American government while he was the prosecutor at the Sierra Leone court. He was awarded the CIA Gold Retirement Medallion when he left by George Tenet, the man who provided the intelligence on the Iraq War. And in 2001, in testimony to this is a quote from George Bush, an executive order signed by George Bush saying that the Taylor regime was a direct challenge to American foreign policy interests. But David Crane, the same man I've been talking about, gave this testimony to the United States Congress in 2006, when he said that it was essential to get Charles Taylor out of the political equation in Liberia in order to enable the new president of Liberia to do her job. It's going to take, just to finish off on this theme, the prosecutor who then concluded the case against Charles Taylor, Brenda Hollis, is herself a former official of United States Air Force intelligence, and even, as you can see in this picture from Bowling Green State University, gives lectures on international criminal justice using her US military intelligence title, Colonel Brenda Hollis. The creation of these tribunals, like the creation of European structures, serves to consolidate a new regime in which American leadership is ensured. Through the tribunals, the United States can profile itself as being a major source of order and righteousness. Institutions like international criminal tribunals or the European Union truly bring a new regime into being. Whether we call them hybrid wars or full-spectrum wars, the United States is a master at creating institutions which it controls, but which control others, and which ensure a radical and long-lasting legal and social change. This, I submit, is the essence of hybrid warfare. Thank you very much.